Hello and welcome to Unheard, the official podcast of Project Defy. Within this podcast series, we aim at connecting dots between education on one hand and different aspects of society and the economy. In earlier episodes, we had some remarkable insights around the historical colonial roots of modern education systems and how culture shapes ideas and expectations around education. The two dots that we aim to connect in today's episode are education and happiness. And to discuss this, I have a really special guest with us today, Vikram Bhatt. Thank you, Vikram, for being here. Before we ask you to share your thoughts, I would like to introduce Vikram. Vikram is a passionate educator and presently serves as the Joint Director of Bangalore International Center, or BIC, one of Bangalore's foremost public spaces for informed conversations, art, and culture. Prior to this, he has had successful careers in technology, finance, and education, and has played a key role as part of the Delhi Education Minister's task force. He also held senior management positions at Dream a Dream and Teach for India, two of India's leading nonprofits in the educational space. He's an avid long distance runner and a passionate film and theatre buff. Vikram, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Anushka. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So let's begin. I want to start by asking a sort of broad, general question that helps situate happiness in the larger dynamics of society. So, where do you place happiness and well being within this paradigm of largely growth oriented economic development?
Well, to start away, straight away, we begin with the biggest question of them all, right? I want to take a step back. I think you've done one episode already, which kind of talks about the nature of sort of the industrial mindset nature of schools that we have. And you almost have to think of why it is so and what is the purpose of modern education in general, and does it align with the purpose of life itself? And I think that's where the real answers will start coming from. I think most education systems that we have today are focused on making a living and not making a life. So what it ends up doing is children spend, most of their, like all of us have been there. We've spent a better part of 16 years in school, and you don't end up remembering that whole experience as if it was worth it. Very few of us feel that it was worth it. I mean, childhood anyway is fun and it's filled with joy. So I think that part aside, if you adjust for that, most people will say school was kind of okay. My friends were great, but I didn't really enjoy school. So I don't think it's intentionally baked into the design of schools to think about the happiness of students and to ask them to pursue the questions in life that will lead to happiness in life itself. That's sort of asking the right questions that can lead you to happiness in life itself. I don't think we're designed for that per se.
Mm-hmm. And there have been some attempts, if we look at, to situate happiness even within this conversation around the economy. Examples like Bhutan or some states like Kerala. What is your take on this from a larger, societal perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I personally feel the easiest way to make someone unhappy is to ask them if they are happy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the easiest way to to not be happy is to start thinking about, am I happy or why am I happy? Ask those questions. If it's a natural state, it happens. And the societal, I guess one can say, efforts or governmental efforts in some ways also to measure well-being of citizens and happiness and then to promote it. I think it becomes self-serving and its own problematic thing in the end, because I think Bhutan now feels pressure to be number one every time in the happiest thing. And, a lot of these surveys are done through interviews and there's a lot of desirability bias. So I'm not sure you can make that assessment that Bhutan is indeed the best country in the world, but of our happiest country in the world all the time. But I get the sense that, if you just bring it back to our lives. If you live around nature, if you have more green cover, if you have more leisure time, if you have uh, family around you, strong relationships, these things do lead to more happier societies. And I think that we understand. So that can be a focus for governments. I think the larger question really becomes this debate between a consumerist society where happiness almost can be bought through goods, or some form of happiness certainly can be bought through goods or money, and the other one saying that that's not really the case, it's something more intangible, it's something more nuanced, and that's what we go for. That kind of is other two schools. And I feel like most societies, advanced societies being in the former bucket, I think that's where you're seeing now more widespread efforts to try and say, how do we make society more happy, or like at least well adjusted? Japan's having this problem, Northern Europe and Northern and Western Europe's having this problem, where they're extremely wealthy, they have everything they could ask for, yet something eludes them. And I think that's sort of what the quest is about. India, luckily or otherwise, we've made a lot of progress in that regard, in about understanding what keeps the human spirit going. We have thousands of years of literature around it. So in some sense, we know how to do it, but I think we fall back on the basic things that can tend to make us unhappy, like traffic or lack of infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point about this sort of confluence of consumerism on one hand and also happiness index rankings, right? I think a lot of the countries that are pretty high on this index also happen to be consumer societies, and it raises a question about measurement, as you pointed out. What are these indicators for measuring happiness? And I think, from my understanding, one of the main indicators is also GDP per capita, along with similar, metrics. And
Yeah.
I think there's also a large question as to how this sort of one size fits all styled assessment of happiness works in societies or cultures that may actually understand happiness very differently.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, a lot of Eastern societies value happiness of a group over happiness of an individual, whereas Western societies don't. So therein you have your first big divergence. So if you're using the same tool or instrument to measure happiness across both, I'm sure you'd get uh, some biased results.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned that India also has a long tradition of its own in ideas of happiness. I understand that some of these have influenced the happiness curriculum, which we will talk about in a bit more detail later.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the role of education, more specifically in cultivating happiness. So, I think we both agree that feeling safe and happy are important to engage in any form of learning. And more recently in India, there have been attempts at introducing happiness in the curriculum. And this perhaps also mirrors a shift in emphasis within educational policies over the decades.
Yeah.
Yet, many educational institutions continue to measure their progress through rankings in standardized tests, assessments, or board exam marks. So, in light of this, where do you see happiness competing with other educational priorities?
Yeah. I want to just start it off with like an operating definition, as I like to call it. We tend to confuse the idea of happy feelings or expressions of happiness with happiness itself. And this is an important distinction to make, that very often we we feel a certain outburst of happiness and we express it and it comes out through our being. But whereas the actual state of happiness is something far more calmer, it's far more steady state, if I might, and it allows you to almost be untouched by the world or by the vagaries of the world. That's really sort of the premise of happiness, particularly by a lot of the Eastern thinkers. And in our efforts to bring happiness into society and schools, we focus a lot on happy feelings, right? Like our children singing and dancing, and um, the the stimuli response model of happiness, which is a little transient. It is quite transient, actually, not just a little transient. So moment that stimulus is gone, you probably don't feel that happy anymore. And that's the challenge that we need to parse through. So a lot of that, if you bring it down to an education system, can it be taught? Or, the kind of question you were asking, what priority does it take? I suppose it's getting interesting, because as a world, we are far more developed than we were 120 years ago when this system took root, and it needed workers at that time. That the world needed, the industrial world needed workers, and that was the larger purpose of of uh, of education, or mass education. So a lot of the things we learned were in some ways projections or assumptions, right? Like you learn the atomic structure, as in any one of us closes our eyes, we can see it instantly. But none of us has ever seen it under a microscope, or even in any other form. But what happens is, you believe that that's what the atom looks like, and that belief is what gives you scientific temper. So in the same way, I think there are certain learnable aspects of happiness, um, of of a happy state of being, which can be practiced. Which again, you have to make assumptions, or you have to make leaps of faith when you're in school, and say, Ki, this is how it is. Please believe us and do it. And when you do it over and over again, it leads to a state later in life where you're able to at least have uh, that stay with you, or have that as a skill that stays with you. So which is, I think, where we are headed. I think a lot of, at least developed nations, are talking about well-being as an outcome of school education, or being able to be aware and measure your own well-being as an outcome, like of an educated citizen. So that, I think, is happening as we're becoming developed. And I suppose the larger question everyone's asking is, if AI takes all our jobs, what will we do really? There are no jobs to do. So might as well at least find some way to keep your calm, to keep your mind calm. And that's how I think we're headed there. But to answer your question very directly, I believe it can be taught, and it is taking importance in schools. It's just a matter of how we choose to do it is, I think, still not clear to many.
Right. So you're saying that there is a slow increasing prioritization in this otherwise curricular-oriented model of schooling.
Yeah, if you just look at report cards, right, that's a good marker. So particularly if you look at report cards in progressive schools, which are, I would just say, wealthier schools, for lack of a better proxy at this point. But if you went back to schools which have a slightly philosophical bent, like the Krishnamurti schools, for example, they've always asked teachers to observe the nature of the student and comment on that. And now those elements are coming into many more mainstream schools as well. That, is this a child playful? Is the child happy? Is it self-content? And what are some of the elements that allow this child to be that way? Is it in art? Is it in sport? So a sort of more well-rounded view of the child in the school setup is now almost mandatory, or at least certainly it's become a far more mainstream than it used to be.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like when people sometimes think of the Indian educational system, the first image that conjures is about this extreme high stakes testing, and every stage of the school is marked by
12th standard exam, like
pressure.
everything about
The
that.
10th
Yeah.
is the important one, and then the 12th, and then entrance exams. And often I feel, of course, I think I was not probably in school when any kind of happiness was attempted to be taught, but my memories are very directly linked to these high pressure environments. So it's interesting, and it's. I think we'll also go more into how students, teachers, and other communities have been responding to some of these things outside in terms of their own perceptions or changes in behavior. So
It's almost very effectively we teach unhappiness. We're, we're extremely professional and competent at making kids unhappy. So we've got that part right. Now just do the opposite.
Yeah. So I think let us move on to discussing different kinds of trials and errors and experiments in implementing happiness within the whole spectrum of education. And perhaps we can begin with the schooling system itself, and one experiment that you've been closely associated with, which is the happiness curriculum in Delhi.
Mm-hmm.
So, before going into what it is and the components, I wanted to ask that maybe for you to explain a little where this idea came from, and a bit about the political economy considerations of implementing something like this, because it's perhaps one of the first attempts by a government in India to focus on happiness and education as a political issue. So, what were the specific circumstances that led to this being seen as a priority?
I was privileged. I would say that I had some role to play in the development and rollout of this curriculum, which was largely the brainchild of the Education Minister of Delhi, Mr. Sisodia. He himself is someone he practices Vipassana. He's been dabbling in philosophy for quite a while. So I think his basic premise, it's very simple in its construct. He says that up to grade 8, the goal of schools should be to make students emotionally sound so that they're able to live happily in their relationships in the world. So as adults, you prepare them for that life. How do you become emotionally sound or have a strong foundation for your emotional being, if you might. And then in the higher grades, grade 9 to 12, you start developing professional skills that will serve you through life. And all the other subjects that you study should be sort of an extension of curiosity. It must be coupled with curiosity. So you're studying things that you like and you are excited by, but the main goal of school should be grade 1 to 8, you build emotional soundness in students. And in grades 9 to 12, you build professional soundness. And the rock on which the professional soundness sits is having an entrepreneurial mindset. So if you can build an entrepreneurial mindset in students, then you serve them well, whether they do jobs or whether they start businesses. It always serves them well in their professional life. That's the basic assumption. And according to him, both of these are mindset challenges, which means it can be taught. So if you look at the entire work, Carol Dweck's work over the last 2 decades now, which is based on the idea of the growth mindset, and it's been adapted into various subject specializations and, of course, in corporate. But it has revolutionized the way we speak to children, right? Like when you, in schools especially, where you want them to develop a certain mindset that helps them in adult life to continuously come across challenges but not be fazed by them. So that was the vision of Mr. Sisodia when he started this. And he was very clear that he didn't want to call it anything else. He called it happiness just as a way to, in many ways, protect it from future appropriations, if you might, right? If it was called some other curriculum, like a mindfulness curriculum or a dhyan curriculum, or there is a school in Gangtok, I believe, which has something called the Dharma curriculum. It's a Buddhist inspired idea, but again, it's a similar concept as to thinking about what makes a good life very early on. But you can imagine the word dharma being in a curriculum could be appropriated then into anything else. So he was very clear that I wanted to be a neutral word, which will not be changed too much. So happiness, and won't be opposed too much also. He was very smart about it. Otherwise, there's always opposition to any name that you come up with. So that was one way of circumventing the political challenges around a curriculum like this. And, him and the CM of Delhi, Mr. Kejriwal, had anyway made a big bet that their entire political model would be based on health and education. So that had taken off. The happiness curriculum was almost the culmination of all of the work, which was building great infrastructure, getting kids caught up to reading and writing, basic reading and writing, having teacher training in place. So the happiness curriculum came almost at the end of it. It was almost one of the last experiments, if you might. So that way, it fit well into the political paradigm, what they were thinking of, what they were envisioning. But the real challenge, politically, if you might, or bureaucratically, if you might, was to create a space in the daily curriculum where it is valued. So again, if you say, okay, we want to make an attempt to teach happiness to our students, and you say we'll do it once a week, it doesn't work. Then you're just it's tokenism and it's lip service. It's not actually going to yield benefits. It's the same thing, right? If I say I'm going to teach you math and quadratic equations, but you will learn it once a month or once a couple of weeks, you just can't remember it. I mean, you won't even know the basic formulas when you have to go in and explain to someone what you have. So that repetition is necessary for learning. And that's, I think, was the harder thing. He had to navigate, invest a lot of people in the idea that, boss, we need a period, and we need a period in the first half of the day when children are fresher. So I think that was the real thing. I mean, to if you think of what a success it was, a couple of states copied it verbatim. The curriculum was just picked up as it was and put in, and also there was a nice um element of showmanship that he figured out, where he had the Dalai Lama come in and inaugurate the curriculum. So it really had a visibility from day one. It was a very interesting way of propagating this curriculum and getting buyers, of getting people to buy into it from day one.
Yeah, I think it is remarkable to see that the effort had a ripple effect with other state governments. I know of Himachal, for example, that showed interest following the implementation.
And Uttarakhand took it.
Uttarakhand as well. And I think it has been an interesting shift. Of course, not to say that nothing ever has been done before in Indian politics, but of late, I would say it's an interesting shift in discourse. And at least to even if there's a debate within education, to at least center that and then see how that can be treated as a.
There have been other educators or heads of state who have come into India, and then Delhi, who have wanted to first see our happiness class in action, because it caught people's imagination, which is a good thing, I think. And then the fact that there was a structure to it and there was a way of thinking through the progression of the curriculum, that I think also impressed a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, you mentioned that, it would be lip service if it were done once a week. And I think it's done almost daily, if I'm not.
Yes.
And so coming to the curriculum itself, you pointed out an interesting distinction about the feeling of happiness and, other elements, and therefore the need to teach them. And I believe, we had a chance to do some research around the curriculum itself, and it seems that a lot of the activities, center around instilling positive emotions and on areas like respect, gratitude, and trust. And that a lot of the inspiration is coming from the field of positive psychology. Maybe if I ask from a sociological perspective, so we see children like adults are part of community networks and are greatly influenced by societal norms and dynamics. For instance, a child who may face discrimination owing to his or her gender or caste identity is likely to experience negative emotions both within and outside the school. So, in relation to the objectives of the curriculum, I wanted to ask, what has been the approach to address these mental health implications of societal conflict or marginalization in understanding and identifying the causes and solutions of happiness or the lack thereof?
It's a great question, Anushka, and I think there are lots of anecdotal examples I can give you about this, but I'll come back to those examples in a little bit. I'll just explain how the curriculum is set up a little bit. And you already mentioned that there's a daily period for happiness. And the other part that I didn't mention earlier is that it is taught by your regular teachers. There's no special teacher for happiness. So a teacher who's a math teacher is trained on how to impart it. And the curriculum is reasonably simple, or I would say the curriculum is extremely simple in its execution and rollout. So anyone can actually teach it. So I'll approach it as a structural point of view first, and then as a more philosophical or design point of view. So structurally, it's a period a day taken by a teacher that the children already know, and it's divided into three parts, which is there is a mindfulness meditation part, which happens on Monday. Then there is stories, which are on Tuesday and Wednesday. And then there is activities which are on Thursday and Friday. And Saturday is a day for expressions, where students reflect on what they've been through and they express what they're seeing. Now, all of these are designed in the same way, which is that except the mindfulness part, which there is a guided piece where the students go through it. But the stories and the activities are very simple, very quick. So if it's a 30-minute period, the story or activity is finished in the first 8 to 10 minutes. And then the rest of the time is for students to discuss it. And a lot of the stories and activities encourage students to talk about how they feel about it. What were elements of the story that resonated with them? Were they ever in such a position? Do they know someone else who's in that position? That kind of stuff. Very easy conversation-based stories with very simple observations about human nature and what drives human beings. So many of them have come from Zen parables, they've come from Hindu literature, they've come from stories from the Bible, all of these stories where it's these are those stories anyway, but it's just, I think, repurposed for this case, for this curriculum. But from a design point of view, I think what it was trying to do is that the hypothesis is that happiness exists at three levels. So the first level is a very sensorial level of happiness, which you eat an ice cream and you feel happy. So it's a stimulus response model of happiness, which no human being needs to be taught. All of us are hardwired to chase that dopamine hit that we all seek. So it didn't focus on that at all. The second layer of happiness, or second level of happiness, is what you get from your relationships. So your happiness is directly proportional to the strength of your relationships. And these relationships are relationship with yourself, with your close family and neighbors, with your larger community, and with nature. These are the four levels of your relationships. So you build each one of them up strongly so that you're able to contextualize your own state of happiness based on that. And the last one is, and this form of happiness, the second form of happiness, is far more long-lasting than the initial stimulus response form of happiness, which is very, very transient. The last form of happiness, which is the most long-lasting, which is what one feels when you have a deep understanding or an insight about the nature of life itself. When you understand how certain things work at a very deep, permanent way, and you're able to resolve it for yourself, it gives you this deep sense of happiness. So a simple thing would be, how much money do I really need to be happy? If you can answer that question and you have a sense for it, an actual numerical sense, I mean, it actually leads to a very, very happy life, because that one very big question is out of your head. So, with that design principle in mind, what the curriculum tried to do was focus on the second one, which is the strength of your relationships. So all the stories, the activities, the mindfulness pieces, the expression were meant to refresh and to get students to reflect on again and again and speak about it, about their various relationships that govern their life. And that's sort of the structure of it. Now, coming back to what it did to them, right? Like, which is the more interesting thing. Straight off the bat, one of the most interesting things that happened is that, because there are stories around it, there's a story in the curriculum which actually talks about a father who keeps making sacrifices for his child, and so that she can have the best education, she can have the best life outcome. And she constantly always says that you didn't give me enough, you didn't give me enough. And then one day she overhears him saying that I'm not going to get something for myself this year because of this. A very simple idea. And in discussions, a lot of students came up with reflections saying parents do this all the time. So much so that now students would go home and check if they ask, have you eaten? Like when their mother or their father would say, eat your food, I've kept it for you. They would say, have you eaten? And if the parent would say yes, they'd go check, have they actually eaten? In the sense, is the quantity of food small enough to say that they've eaten? And so it's those kind of thinking that putting in a family setup to put someone else's well-being or state of mind as important, to make it as important as your own, was one very important shift that we saw. Another one that happened was that this was particularly in girls' schools where we saw it, where they felt that a lot of Delhi and many parts of India, boys get to go to private schools and girls are sent to government schools, because largely there isn't enough faith in the idea that the girl will be of uh, of help to the family as she gets older, and even if she studies, their thinking is she's going to get married and move on. And there a lot of girls always felt they were inferior, to their male siblings, because we're in government schools. And then through this curriculum, that reflection, that being able to speak, that sense of community building, they were like, wow, this is something that's not even there in my brother's school. And you realize that I now have a way to control my own being or state of mind, which even private schools or elite schools are not giving them. So they felt this is a great way. So now we don't feel secondary to anyone else. And that was a reflection that came up again and again, that it used to bother them and now it doesn't bother them as much. I'm not sure it completely ever goes away, but it stopped becoming the first thing that is on your mind. And which is what curriculums like these have the power to do, right? If it's almost based on this idea that for a country this large, we will never be able to have adequate mental health support for everyone. It's just simply not going to happen. The number of experts will not be there. But if we can create safe spaces where from an early age, students learn how to express what they're feeling responsibly. First, understand what they're feeling and then express it in a safe space, or find safety and then express it. It leads to far better mental health in the longer term. And that is something we can do, that this curriculum has proven. It's a learned habit, and you can create those structures going forward on your own. And that's, I think, a larger part of it. The headwinds that these students face, whether it's caste, whether it's gender, whether it's any other socio-economic reasons, they're able to see, okay, I'm feeling this way. If I speak about it, I feel a little better. And then eventually they say, wow, this doesn't really matter as much as I thought it did.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's interesting. It seems that, the sort of relationships within the family are definitely positively influenced by an increasing awareness, perhaps of
And friendships as well.
friendships
And your close friends in school.
yeah,
So
and so on. Perhaps in future iterations of the curriculum, one may also find, a sort of larger engagement with these other dynamics of inequality, because I don't know, just feel that maybe, yeah, these may be playing large into, causes of unhappiness over a period of time. So would be interesting to also see how that is factored, perhaps, with time. um, but coming to, assessments, I think we read that the curriculum itself does not necessitate formal assessments and aims at using these experiential methods, stories, and so on that you spoke of. um, so I wanted to ask, so what has been the experience of seeing this pedagogical inclination reflected in other aspects of schooling?
again, I think there's a Brookings report that has a little more data based on it, which sampled schools to get the effectiveness or some kind of monitoring and evaluation of the curriculum. But what I can say is I was very deeply involved with it in the first 2 years of the curriculum rollout, after which I took a broader role in the government. So I wasn't as day-to-day involved. But what we saw most importantly was relationships between students and teachers got better, because there were spaces now for conversation. And a lot of that, I mean, we all can go back to our school years and remember that in the end, we didn't learn subjects. We learned from teachers. So if there was a teacher that you really liked, you started liking that subject. It didn't matter whether it was chemistry or history. It really depended on this teacher. So what has happened here is that there has been an element of relationship building that has happened between students and teachers, which then comes, like I said earlier, these are regular academic teachers who are teaching happiness. So it then spills over into regular classrooms as well. So a simple example I can give you is that if a class was being too noisy, now they have a structure by which they can do mindful meditation for 2 minutes and come back to quiet, as opposed to the teacher having to shout over them. It's a technique that they've known and practiced. Now in Delhi, they've practiced it for the last 4 to 5 years. So imagine you're a seventh grader and you've done it for 3, 4 years. At least you know a way to get back to that state of mind. And I think the biggest thing that it has done is before an exam or before getting on stage, before a big anxious moment, it gives you a tool to just, it's just simple deep breathing, or you do these inhalations and exhalations and just get it out of your system. So it allows students to be far less anxious before these big moments in their life, which are, unfortunately, we make exams into big moments in students' lives. But that's what it has helped in as well. But there is, to prove that there's been a direct link between the happiness curriculum and improved academic outcomes, it's too early. That is something the whole world is waiting for. Is there some holy grail or silver bullet that will just magically lead to students doing well in studies and not feeling pressurized? I don't think it's there yet.
So what I hear you saying is that, there's been a sort of spillover in terms of behavior with perhaps people developing more resilience to deal with stress and anxiety. Um, but, again, coming back to the assessment part, right? Because I think a bit earlier we also talked about one of the big factors that plagues Indian education and perhaps other education systems is this commotion around high stakes testing and the pressures around it. And I'm wondering, and just putting myself maybe as a student in that scenario, I feel perhaps, I may think that, okay, I am doing this happiness curriculum for now, but after 2 years, I need to get serious and I need to do my board exam. So, I mean, I don't know, how do you see this sort of almost grouping of periods of one's lives based on, okay, now is the time for happiness and now is the time to get serious. How do you see that these transitions or almost distinctions that are made between life stages?
Yeah, if I personally feel if you have done this for long enough, which is what the curriculum aims to do, you start in grade 1 and you do it for 8 years, then by the time, and the mindfulness piece, we don't stop even in ninth grade onwards. So grade 1 to 12, you're doing some element of this practice the whole time. What happens is it becomes an integral part of you. You don't need to then separate, oh, I'm going to go study, I'm going to now not do happiness. These structures become so ingrained into your being that you're able to use them as and when you want them, which really is the goal, right? It's, if I just take a simple example from the regular curriculum, it's how we learn tables by rote early on, and we don't know the point of doing it by rote. But what happens is further on, when you get down the math curriculum in later grades, you need um, that skill, that instant ability to recall what is something times something in so many parts of mathematics, in estimation, in rounding, in all of those things. And that becomes a very innate skill. You're not thinking about it anymore, and you're just doing it, which is what the goal is for a curriculum like this. It becomes such an integral part of you that you're using those structures day in and day out. And I think it's almost like students will say that this is as important as a science curriculum, because it teaches me something about my life which is outside of school. It tells me how to live my life outside of school, right? As, studying science or math or history very well and doing well in that exam gives you a certain kind of validation, but it probably sets you up for college and work and those kind of things. But I don't somehow always see the link between that and the world that I live in. Whereas here, there is a direct link between what I'm learning in school and what I'm going to go live in my society. And that's where that's where the demand comes from. Students love it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. You I think the happiness curriculum is definitely an excellent initiative, and just the fact that it's one of the it is a major effort that's been made by a government. So politically speaking, I would say it's interesting shift in the discourse. But let us move maybe to some experimentations outside formal schooling. And it was interesting for me to actually read through one of the concept documents of the happiness module, co-authored by some of the NGOs that were involved, where there were references to Rabindranath Tagore's ideas around education system as a factory, which led to unnatural pressure among children,
Yeah.
and of course led him to establishing Shanti Niketan. And I'm quoting from the report, that where children had liberty and freedom to pursue what they wanted.
Yeah.
So I find this very interesting because it's a maybe the goal is similar, but taking it out of the schooling system. And the question then becomes, what sort of role do you see these alternative models of learning or different imaginations of education playing in contributing to happiness among children, or broadly, among children?
I think the alternative models of education are going to constantly push our thinking about the relevance of the system itself. So, why does an alternative model come up? Because there's something in the main system that is not working. And it is almost a proof of that. And what good system designers will do is keep looking at alternative models and try and bring in elements of those forms of education into the mainstream.
Mhm.
So one of the things that has happened with this curriculum is that social emotional learning, which was considered by most accounts as alternative about 10, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't considered a priority. It would be, or even if you go back, let's say, I don't have an exact number, but let's say if you go back 50 to 70 years, you didn't have art and sport as regular parts of school. It was just you go play, or you didn't prioritize it as a subject which was taught in schools in a very concerted manner. They've all come into our school systems through alternative models where they said, physical activity is good for the growth of the child. Engaging with art does help them build into better citizens and better human beings. So then that became part of the mainstream. So which is what I feel alternative models will keep doing. They'll push our thinking about what could be more valuable to students in the current setup, and certainly what has stopped being valuable. Both of these questions will come to us from alternative models. Where do I see it going? I personally feel the more and more schools now, there is a larger acceptance of alternative schools. Very early on, you would have a Rabindranath Tagore or a J. Krishnamurti or a Maria Montessori who would say, this is how a school should be. It should be driven by the learner's desire and interest. It should be paced at the level of the learner. The learner should be able to tell you what he or she has learned, as opposed to you figuring out what they should have learned and testing it. These are all elements that were there, and now it's becoming more and more mainstream. If you look at the best IB schools, for example, all these elements are already in there, and which I think is a good sign. I think that's where the world is kind of going to go to. I mean, the best example is from outside of education, right? Like if you look at automobiles, we've known for a good 20 years that fossil fuels are not going to be the form of transport that we should rely on going forward. And there were alternative vehicles like the Prius by Toyota came out so long back, almost 20 years ago. And earlier it was a bit of a an anomaly, or oh, it's a attractive thing for someone. Chapriyas chala raha, it's a statement. But now it's electric cars are becoming more and more mainstream, and it's all because of that constant pressure that they've created and the advocacy component. So I feel like that's how the two will interact.
Sure. So mostly from, if I understood correct, you think that the presence of alternatives can push the system towards reform or towards.
Very well articulated. I would say that's a really good article.
And I think yeah, the example of the Montessori schools or various examples. In fact, just in Bangalore, I think we see a lot of alternative schools, and it's also interesting because in a previous episode we mentioned this as well, that there is often this air of elite privilege around alternative schools, and I think sort of demystifying that or having alternatives that are accessible becomes very important, because it also shouldn't be a case that uh, child participation or children's opinions are only the accessible to a few people who can afford it. So in that sense, I think there's also a need within alternative systems to make themselves more accessible to communities, and in a concerted way. So that's yeah, that's interesting. And I think if I may just add a little bit around nooks here, and perhaps a little how we feel about this, I think what differentiates also nooks from a lot of alternative systems, that are trying to center happiness or choice-based learning is precisely this, that we find that it is important to democratize this idea of learning and choice to communities as well. And one of the main points of difference, even though I think the goals of happiness are very much at the core, is perhaps also looking at it from a more community perspective, trying to center relationships between, of course, individuals, and look at them as part of the community, and how that community dynamic can actually further happiness, whether it's through learning or whether it's even just the presence of a safe space. So I think, of course, different conceptualizations and different ways of addressing it, but a common link is that happiness and a safe space is an enabling factor, and perhaps the most important factor for any learner, irrespective of age, I feel.
Yeah, it's just, having this, you have to free education from the fear of making mistakes. That's the real goal, right? And a NOOC or models like the NOOC almost internalizes that at its core, that the whole act of learning has to be filled with mistakes. You almost reward that approach, whereas our conventional systems punish that approach, right? I'm not saying you have to go intentionally and make mistakes, but in exploration, in trying out something, you are going to make a mistake. And that it must almost be clear to students that there's a whole buffet of mistakes, and which one do I want to make, right? So I think that's the kind of thinking that needs to come into the mainstream, and it is coming in. Like a lot of assessment is getting more open-ended. If you looked at, which is how the world's problems really are, right? It doesn't come in neat boxes and answer it for 3 marks. Like you will be, if you have to solve for a problem that the world is actually facing or you are facing in the world, it will most likely be very, very messy and full of like iterations and trying things and failing and doing it. And which is how, and subjectivity, I think that's another big part of it. Like the one person's solution may not look the same as someone else's. And I think that's where schools are waking up to that reality, at least the good schools are, and thinking about how do you bring that element of subjectivity into assessment and not punish it, but reward it. And I'm going to just make one more point, just to belabor the point a little bit, because of what you said about these alternative schools having a slight elitist tag to them. I mean, I agree with what you're saying in that regard. It is right now the privileged class that can actually bet on it. But if I just go back to another example outside of education, which is the smartphone, the iPhone, which was the first smartphone that was out there, was so elite for the first 3 to 5 years, that it was almost like a status symbol to own it. But over time, it has democratized the whole idea of having a smartphone. Now everyone has one. It's affordable. Again, the iPhone is still what it was. It was the one of the most elite brands, but it has created a whole slew of options below it, which are now accessible to everyone, which is really my plea to educators, right? That alternative schools do some things really well. Is there a way that some of those elements can start coming even today into mainstream schools so that some elements of that elitist idea get challenged or diluted?
And maybe because we're also talking about this confluence of systems, you were closely associated with a collaboration between Bangalore International Center and DeFi, the summer camp,
Yeah.
where the self-designed learning pedagogy was used. And I think, from my understanding, a lot of the emphasis was on exploration, fun, creativity in relation to learning. So, how do you see such partnerships and experiences contributing to shifting the mainstream conversation around happiness and education?
See, I'm a firm believer in taking whatever opportunity you get and get your foot through the door. So, if it means saying that after school we're going to have nooks which will be there in mainstream schools, kids who are interested can come, we take it. We take what we get, and we just keep pushing the envelope further, which what it does is, to come back to your question, how do you make happiness more mainstream? From what I've seen in the way kids worked in the Nook, right? Like, it's that state of flow is happiness. When you've thought of a problem yourself, you kind of find a solution. You fight and fight and fight, but in your head you're trying this out. But then you start working on something, and all this happens naturally. You're not thinking of the next step, and of course there's an adult to guide you and to nudge you along the way, but it's all coming from within you, and it creates a state of flow, which is a very, very beautiful form of happiness, where you're just at ease. You're just not trying to force anything, which, if you create opportunities in schools for children to feel that way more and more, I think you'll achieve your outcome. So whether it happens by creating nooks, I feel like the structure is not as important as the intention. So it could happen through other forms as well. But to start with, what we have to figure out is what is the best way for students to experience that.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting. I remember being at the final, the show where the teams presented their work, and if I remember there being a back scratching chair and a farting machine and all kinds of in very interesting projects. And I think, yeah, just this idea of also demystifying technology, and it's so important, especially like we see news of parents enrolling 5-year-olds in coding classes, and there seems to be this new iteration of pressure for this. It's like the forms of pressure keep changing, so within that, to recenter fun, whether it's in relation to tech or learning, I think is very necessary. So it was great to see that happen, and I think you played a really critical role in making it happen, so that was yeah.
My pleasure. I could do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're almost at time. And do you have any sort of last closing thoughts, any ideas or takeaways from this conversation that you think we can pick up maybe in further conversations, or for us to reflect on more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the role of organizations and people like us who are in many ways choosing education as a career. We're choosing to be involved with students or educational institutions as a chosen career, as opposed to just falling into it. I think we have a higher burden on asking the questions that matter, and in this case, this is a great question to ask. what is the role of education and in ensuring happiness of the individual? Is that even should that even be an objective? And I think those questions are important for people like us to ask, people who are intentionally in this space. And from what I've seen, my hypothesis is that it is. And so when you see things like I've told, I can't remember how many people about Project Defy and the idea of nukes, right? Because it's an idea that definitely works, and it can be scaled very easily. It doesn't need much to scale per se, but it's just a lot of times it's just about people knowing about it and accepting that this is the way of doing it. To me, that is the burden on us, that we must take these conversations further, take it to as many people as we can, and keep fighting in our own things, because I believe it is the most important purpose of education. Making someone have the tools to be happy by themselves, to be self-sufficient for their own happiness, should be one of the most important goals of education.
Absolutely. I think I I really learned a lot from this conversation, and thank you so much for coming and talking. I think we can agree that happiness is very integral part of human flourishing, and educational approaches across the spectrum have an important role to sort of play in this endeavor. And for all those who listened, thank you, and we hope this conversation was fun to listen to, and that it raised hopefully more questions than answers. On that note, thank you, and keep an eye on social media handles for other episodes in Unheard series. And thank you for listening.